Three little words. So much of English to this point has been the story of big words, of the aureate and inkhorn vocabulary terms, of the new worlds of words that came in with science and technology, with exploration and colonization, words from European and non-European languages, coinages and polysyllables that broke like waves over the shore of England. We saw how Alexander Gill rejected this new influx of terms, and he rejected it in a language redolent of metaphor and figure that we can see, I think, as well in the language of his most famous pupil, John Milton, in Paradise Lost. The English language for Gill is horrid in its root sense. It is bristling with the polysyllables of loans and coinages. But there were little words as well. And the history of the English language is a history of little words. Three little words like do, like will, and like, well, not even a word, the suffix ing. These are forms that are so radically changing their function and their meaning in the 16th and 17th centuries that we might say that the very shape of modern spoken idiomatic English hinges on their changes. So in this lecture, I'm going to pay attention to some very little words. And I'm going to look at some little words as changing their form and function. And I'm going to conclude with a reading of a great text, a bit of Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1, as really a play about little words. Now, the English of the 16th and early 17th centuries is not modern English. True, the great vowel shift had changed pronunciation from Middle English, and many of the words that were coming in from science and exploration and from coinages and from borrowings, many of them would fill in the English vocabulary as we still have it today. But certainly in idiom, in spoken expression, in colloquialism, the language of the time of Shakespeare is not our own. What I would like to suggest is that this very idiomatic quality of modern spoken English is what emerges in the age of Shakespeare, the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And I want to just pause for a minute to say something about the nature of idiom itself. Now, when we talk about idiom, we talk about expressions that are, if you like, more than the sum of their constituent parts. So that if, for example, you were to look up the words get and over, under, into, out of in a dictionary and try to put them together, that wouldn't tell you what expressions like get over, get under, get into, get out of, get up on, what these kinds of expressions mean. They are idioms in that they collocate together meanings that go beyond simply the lexical and the dictionary. And it is this idiomatic quality of English that emerges at the time. I think a large part of that idiomatic quality comes from changes in the verb do. Now, do has a very ancient history. It goes all the way back to Indo-European, and it appears in Old English and in Middle English, but the uses of the word changed dramatically in the 16th and 17th centuries. And one could argue that the tone of modern spoken English is in many ways shaped by the way in which we use the verb do. In addition, the ing forms are going to add to the flavor of our language. This is a suffix that also goes back to Indo-European origins, that survives in the Germanic languages, and that signals nouns and participles of verbs. But the way in which it comes to be used in the 16th and 17th century gives rise to a new structure of the English verbal system. Now let's look at do. As a full verb, Do means to perform an action. I did this. This is its oldest and most sustained use, and this appears in Old English. But do can also be used as a replacement verb. I went to the store, and having done that, I bought some eggs or something like that. So here, the verb do replaces the verb go. That is, go, went. I went to the store and having done that. In other words, we don't say I went to the store and having gone to the store. Well, we could say that, but we can also say having done that. In other words, do is a replacement verb, and this usage develops in the Middle English period. What develops in the early modern English period in the 16th century is what we call a periphrastic or a placeholding verb. Do you know the way? This is a way of asking a question. And you'll remember from my previous lectures that in Old and Middle English, and even in certain forms of early modern English, the way you asked a question was by inverting the order of the subject and the verb in a sentence. You know the way is a statement. Know you the way is a question. What emerges in the 16th century is a way of asking a question by using the verb to do and its forms as a periphrastic or as a placeholder. So what we see also is the way in which do can function as an emphatic modal or helping verb. Do you know the answer? I know the answer. I do know the answer. This emphasis on do develops also in the 16th century. The idea, did you do it? I did it. I did do it. What does Othello say at that great moment in his play, Perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee? He's able to use do in a new way to emphasize the fact that he really does love her. In addition to these changing forms of do, there were changes in the forms of ing. Old English had words that ended in ing or ung, as did all the Germanic languages, to indicate a noun's ownership or genealogy, or to turn a verb into a noun. Hrunting is the name of a sword. The Schildings in Beowulf are a clan or family. And in modern German, you use the ung ending in order to signal a noun made out of a verb or a concept noun. This is true too in Old and in Middle English, and in the Middle English period, the ing forms as participles were used, but only in Southern dialects. Now, what do I mean by that? Going, having. I'm going to the store, or I'm having something, or I was doing something. All of these ing forms as participles in the Northern and the Midland forms of English are enda or anda, havanda, lovanda. Lovanda is the participial form of to love. In the south of England, you'd say loving. In the Midlands and the north, you'd say lovanda or lovenda. And so this is a regional dialect form that is gradually accepted into standard English by the close of the Middle English period. And it's another product, I think, of that great migration of dialectical forms and of regional speakers into the London metropolis. Now, what happens in the 16th century is that some of these forms start to enter into the metropolitan standard. And so ing forms develop as follows. I'll do this in the abstract. The X being Y, he did this. The house being on fire, he ran out. All right. Now, that is a kind of expression that you can only start to say towards the end of the 16th century. Or the Xing of the Y, like the mowing of the grass, the growing of the grain, the lowing of the cows. These kinds of expressions using ing are idioms that do not appear until the late 16th century. Expressions such as, "Don't blame me for having done it." Shakespeare is really the first writer to use this form. Or, for example, new ways of expressing perfect tenses. I have been waiting, I had been waiting. In other words, what's going on here is the way of expressing pasts in different ways. I have been waiting means I began an action in the past and it continues into the present. I had been waiting means that I began an action in the past and continued it, and it ended in the past. And these are new ways of using ing to signal these forms. There are also ways of expressing the future. I am going to hit you. I am going to grade your papers. I'm going to get something to eat. While this form, in fact, didn't appear until the late 16th century, it's really not idiomatic in English. In other words, it doesn't gain currency until the 19th. Idiomatic modern English, I believe, is founded on changes such as these. And the point is not simply that these changes alter the way in which we speak, but that they become characteristic of the way we speak. That is, using the verbs of do and using forms in ing are characteristic of the idiom of modern spoken colloquial English. While these things are going on, see, it's almost too natural to avoid, new forms of the pronouns are taking shape. Now, recall that there were two kinds of pronouns. You had the singular and you had the plural, and they corresponded in Old and Middle and Early Modern English to that same kind of pronominal system that you see in the modern European languages, where you had the informal and the formal. And they were you for the formal and the plural, and the for the informal or the intimate and the singular. I want to say a little bit about the third person pronoun. The third person pronoun signals the neuter. Now, you remember in an earlier lecture how I had talked about how grammatical gender was beginning to disappear in the late Old English period. And by the middle of the 13th century, Walter of Bibisworth, in his treatise for aristocrats and gentry trying to learn French, has to remind them that grammatical gender is a central feature of French. Natural gender begins to replace grammatical gender. So instead of saying, say, we've hit, the wife, it, you would say, the wife, she. Now, what happens in the 16th and 17th centuries is that it, if you like, becomes a place where gender and relationships of grammar in general find themselves played out. It and its. Here, a tiny little word. This is our notion of the third person neuter genitive. It's. This is a very late development. This is not it apostrophe s, which is a contraction for it is. This is its. It's time. It's person. But even as late as Shakespeare and the King James Bible, grammatical gender can still be used. Here's a line from The Merchant of Venice. How far that little candle throws his beams. This is not personification. This is a grammatical throwback, if you like. It is, by this time, most likely an archaism, but it's a deliberate archaism, and that is, it harkens back to a time when grammatical gender was still operating. Take this phrase from the King James Bible. If the salt hath lost his savor. That is, the salt has lost its taste. Again, we are not personifying salt as masculine, we're simply going back to a time when grammatical gender mattered. And so this is not personification, it's grammar. But look at the language in flux. Again, in the time of Shakespeare, it and its hadn't fully sorted themselves out. There's a line from King Lear, in which a character says, that nature which condemn it origin. Now, we would have to say that nature which condemns its origin. Shakespeare is being perfectly grammatical for his own time. This is not a question of someone misspeaking. The possessive here is just it. It's not quite sorted out that it's its. So when we see these cracks and fissures in grammar, what we're looking at is a system of pronouns in transition. And this is also true for comparatives and superlatives at this time. Shakespeare can talk about the most unkindest cut of all. And this multiplication is not ungrammatical, it's perfectly grammatical. It is the legacy of later 18th century pedagogues who eliminate things like multiple negation and multiple comparatives and superlatives, believing that they are illogical or contradictory. What else is happening at this time to shape the way in which we speak? There are changes in a set of verbs which we call modal verbs or helping verbs. These are verbs like shall and will, can, may, ought, and the like. And they modify the tense or mood of a main verb, but they cannot by themselves be the only verb in a sentence. That is, in modern spoken English, they cannot take an object alone. They cannot be transitive verbs. Now, originally, these verbs were full verbs. There was a time when you could say something like, I can music. In the 17th century, you could say, I can music, which means I have a certain skill and ability in music. Or Chaucer in the 14th century could say, I shall to God and you, meaning I am indebted to God and you. I owe something to God and you. Or in Old English, you could use may as a full verb, and you could say, each may well, which means I'm in good health. I may be well, but may is being used as a full verb. Now, in the 16th and the 17th centuries, these verbs were changing usage and meaning, and I want to trace some of their development. Shall or should, will and would, may and might, can and could, these are distinctions that arose during this period to create a subjunctive mood comparable to Latin. Now, what does this mean? The subjunctive in Latin was used to express the counterfactual. That is something that hadn't happened. It was also used to express what was called the optative, that is, the desire. Would that Mary would be making pies, you know? Oh, that she would love me. This is a use of a form that is deliberately designed in the 16th and the 17th centuries to evoke a Latin grammatical category, that is, to come up with a real subjunctive in this way. And what happens is that shall and will come to be restricted for forms of the future. By the end of the 16th century, they lose their full verbal sense. So the idea of shall as a form of obligation, this is no longer being used, and will as the form of the action of an individual's will or desire. In modern spoken German, ich will means I want, not I will. This is being used in the King James Bible to translate volo, that is, the verb meaning desire or volition. In everyday speech, what seems to be fascinating to me is the way in which this becomes something of emphasis. I remember when I was a child being taught grammar, I was taught to say that the standard non-emphatic form of expressing futurity was I shall, you will, he will. If you were to be emphatic about it, you were supposed to say, I will, you shall, he shall. Where do we draw the line between grammar and stylistic idiom here? I have no sense now that anybody in modern spoken English makes this kind of distinction. And certainly, I have to think very, 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 very carefully about making such a distinction between shall and will as forms of emphasis. So it seems to me that what's going on here is that there is a change in the modal structure of verbs during the 16th and 17th century, which up until, up until my own lived memory, seems to be operating. And what we see in words like do and shall and will and forms like ing, what we see are changes in the structure of spoken English that make it more idiomatic than it was. So what is happening at this time is a different kind of colloquialism. But we need also to understand the relationship of this colloquialism to, how can I put it, the language of ritual. Now, we can say things like, how is it going? Or how do you do? And these are relatively modern ways of expressing questions of experience. These are idioms of everyday speech, and they rely on these grammatical forms newly developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. But what about formal speech? What about ritual? I would like to close this lecture with an analysis of a wonderful moment in Shakespeare's play Henry IV, Part 1, where the language of ritual is evoked in a new way, and where, for Shakespeare's audience of the late 16th century, the changes in forms of do and will would have been palpable and pointed. And so, here it is. Act 2, Scene 4, Henry IV, Part 1. The young Prince Hal and his old friend Falstaff are taking turns playing parts with each other. They banter back and forth, and Hal says, "Do thou stand for me, and I'll play my father." And so he invites Falstaff to pretend that he is Hal, and Hal will play his father, who is King Henry IV. And finally, in one of the great set pieces of this play, Falstaff, who's playing Hal, gives what may be one of the grandest self-eulogies in all of English literature. And he concludes it by saying the following: "But for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, true Jack Falstaff, valiant Jack Falstaff, and therefore more valiant being as he is old Jack Falstaff, banish not him thy Harry's company. Banish not him thy Harry's company. Banish plump Jack, and banish all the world." And at this moment, Hal, speaking perhaps as his father or speaking as himself, utters what to my mind are the four saddest words in Shakespeare. And he says, "I do, I will." What's happening in this scene? Falstaff is making a plea for the sustained company and support from Prince Hal. And he imagines himself as Prince Hal pleading with Hal's father, King Henry IV, saying how wonderful Falstaff is. And if you banish him, you banish all the world. And what Hal says is, "I do, I will." Now, this play, probably written in the 1590s, uses these little words in ways that could not have been used before. For when he says, "I do and I will," he's using do now in that new sense of the replacement for Falstaff's verbs, banish, I do means I banish. But I do and I will means something else by the end of the 16th century. In 1549, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer put together what he called the Book of Common Prayer. And he put it together for the church under King Henry VIII's successor, Edward VI. Over the next 5 decades, this book, in various revisions, served as the base text for English Protestantism. Its language is familiar to us still today. And I read from the marriage ceremony from the Book of Common Prayer. Dearly beloved friends, we are gathered here together in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. And at this moment, the priest is supposed to turn to the man, and he asks, "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" The man shall answer, "I will." And when he turns to the woman and asks the same question, she shall answer, "I will." This moment from a Shakespeare play and this ritual from the Book of Common Prayer resonate. For what we see now in the marriage ritual is the affirmation of matrimony through new words used in these ways. Do and will are now the loci, if you like, of English understanding and identity. And what happens at the end of this scene in Shakespeare is, I think, not a marriage, but a divorce. That Hal and Falstaff, playing out this comic scene of power, use these little words in deep and profound ways. These pledges now become not pledges of uniting, but pledges of separating. Hal offers up, in essence, not the rituals of marriage, but the rites of a divorce. Shakespeare was a master of the large word and the little word. And in my subsequent lectures, we're going to see how Shakespeare and so many of his contemporaries could take the new world of words, the great vocabulary of expansion, of polysyllables and polysemy, and weave it into a tapestry of the imagination. But as I've stressed here, we need also to look at the little words. We need to see the changes in the modal system of verbs. We need to see the changes in the forms of do and will. And we need to see the ways in which these changes radically affected the rituals of power and desire in early modern England. And so I leave you with I do, I will, the things that I will plan to do, the things that you will hear in later lectures.